Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first lecture for History 180. There are actually three sections to this lecture. I went ahead and split these up so that we have bite-sized themes as opposed to one really long monster lecture, and you'll see those in the module for this week. The first topic is simply defining this territory known as Mesopotamia. And you see that here on the screen with the little tagline, the bumper sticker here, the cradle of civilization. Well, it is kind of an interesting shape, in fact. And if I take you to the map, I'll come back to this slide in a second. If I take you to the map, here it is. Here's your region known as Mesopotamia. And it's where Iraq and Iran, Israel, Lebanon, Syria, it's where all those are today, part of Turkey even. And so right here, we've got this basin. This Fertile Crescent is the lowest geographically elevated region. You know, it's kind of a valley, and around it in the plains here and the mountains here is where water kind of flows down to during heavy rainy seasons or flooding seasons. Now, there are 5 rivers in the world that have a unique phenomena in which they come out of these mountains every year. The water, comes from melting snow, comes down the rivers, and then accompanied with some usual regular rainfall, those rivers overflow a good, quarter mile or so. They overflow their banks. And those rivers coming out of the mountains happen to be carrying a certain mix of minerals and even raw seeds, just kind of wild seeds for different kinds of grains and whatnot. And those rivers then, when they overflow every year, right around the same time each year, they basically fertilize the territory where all that water flows. And so this Fertile Crescent is just one of those areas of the world where you've got rivers that do that very thing. The other areas are the Amazon River, the Nile River, and the Yellow River in China. They also have this particular phenomena where every year they flood, and they happen to have this natural fertilization of the region around those rivers. And this means that we have a time 11,000 years ago where humans, largely coming out of North Africa, in fact, are traveling up this direction as nomads for many millennia. And at some point, some of those humans in small tribes managed to come across this region, this Fertile Crescent, and they settle for a little longer than they normally would. And when they settle for a little longer than they normally would in this region, apparently, they started to notice that every year there were natural grains, foodstuffs that were growing. Grains and dates and figs were actually growing in this region, especially right down here. And what that meant was that you've got observable people that theoretically start to notice that this happens every year, and they start to connect certain factors as to why that might happen, and they experiment with it. And eventually you've got farming, right? It's a big giant leap, but you get a simple form of agriculture that turns into farming. I've got a couple terms for you back on this first slide that I had. Nomadic, if you haven't heard of this, this is something you'll hear in anthropology classes and all that too. Nomadic is a term that basically points to people who do not settle down, but rather they move around. They actually travel following food sources and have no one place that they call home. In reality, they may have a regular pattern of travel where there's a region somewhere where they and maybe a tribe of people wander in a type of pattern where they follow food sources throughout the year as it moves, animals and the different kind of fauna that grows in certain regions that they move to, and weather climate issues and all that. So nomads. This is what people who don't farm do for the most part, nomadically moving about. Now, sedentary is when a group of people settle down and they stay in a place for so long that they're able to find a way to get a food source. Maybe it's because they settled in this Fertile Crescent or something like that, right? Where there's naturally occurring food sources year round. Well, it could be that what ends up happening is that you settle down and they have time to actually develop a culture. What do I mean by that? It's just that a advanced culture that involves maybe 1/4 to 1/2 of your people, instead of 95%, but 1/4 to 1/2 of your people are worrying about collecting food or farming your food and the rest of your people are not doing that. They're doing other things. That leads to the development of complex cultures, political systems, religious systems, technology, trade, that sort of thing, right? That's what happens when you can settle down for a while. And so the other terms to get into then are agriculture, the development of farming. Your book is going to talk a lot about this in the first chapter. And an agricultural revolution is when you actually have an advancement, rapid advancement of agriculture from very simple, let's just live here. It looks like food kind of grows here naturally because of this overflowing river, to let's actually start to artificially fertilize the ground and plant seeds and create farming, which can lead to a surplus of food. Ladies and gentlemen, the staple, the basis, the foundation, the cornerstone of civilization is a surplus of food. People do not develop complex culture if they are starving and dying of starvation. It just doesn't happen. What happens is they become nomadic and they're out there searching for food. So a surplus of food is when you are in a situation where you have enough food that your culture, your tribe, your civilization, your town can have people focusing on other things. Okay, so this is really what is going to happen first 11,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, right here. Okay, and then in other areas it starts off as well. So when we talk about Western civilization, the basis of a lot of the traditions and the settlement patterns and the legal systems and religion and culture that Western civilization draws from right here on this map all the way over to North and South America and beyond, okay, all part of this Western culture, all comes from right in this one spot, which is the oldest area where humans began to settle down over time and habitate. I have a video for you in a bit that'll get further into it. Before I move away from this map, I want to draw you to this, and lecture 3 is what of this week is where we cover the different kingdoms and empires that build up in this region. But Babylonia, Sumeria, Acadia, and Assyria are the major kingdoms, and in these two guys' cases, empires that develop here. And they're the first ones in Western history, so we'll talk about them a little bit. Okay, moving on, just a few things to think about as we go through chapter 1, through your reading and also through lectures, is that what is revolutionary about the people that did settle down and then have time because they were able to figure out how to use nature to teach them how to farm, basically, is developing legal systems, developing complex buildings like ziggurats. These are big temples and palace structures. Cuneiform, which is an early form of writing, and actually gets pretty complex. Irrigation, right, a form of farming. Metalworking, tool creation, trade, transportation. The invention of the wheel is here, all right, is actually right here in the city of Ur. Okay, so this is a pretty major revolution, something different, something greatly changing over time. Okay, now this 3,000-year civilizations that grow in Mesopotamia is what we'll be talking about now, all right? And that's going to be introduced by the video I'm going to show you. And then we have 2 other lectures where we'll talk about more specific things within this 3,000-year period of the very earliest human habitations with cities and the development of advanced culture. By the way, just as a real quick graphic, let me just get to this. I'm not too worried about this stuff because we're going to cover it later. Is right here is a good image of, say, the Euphrates or the Tigris River. And what happens, of course, is in the spring, in combination with a rising river, thanks to the snow melt coming from the mountains and rain, the river overflows. And this happens every year. And the rivers overflow, which means this region where my little pointer is, this region gets the most nutrients from the rivers that the rivers are carrying. Just as mud that is just full of seeds and full of fertilizer that comes naturally from the mountains. And there's going to be natural just agriculture happening here. And people will eventually learn how to move that agriculture further by irrigation, by moving the water and the mud further inland. Down here, the water, when it overflows, comes down the embankments that are naturally occurring around these rivers, and you've got a good region here for grasslands. That's where your eventual cattle herds will be. You'll have shepherds cultivating cattle here. Down here, of course, you've got swampland where the water pools. That's your Fertile Crescent region too, and that's where you've got rivers and lakes and fish and all that stuff. And then, of course, the desert where your nomads still are. And if you have a town here and you're able to stay here, you're sedentary now, and you actually have a surplus of food, and you start to develop math and writing and so many other things, right? The people out here are going to notice that, and at some point they're going to come in. So you're going to also have to develop a military technology and start building walls around your town and that sort of thing. So the development of culture is an interesting process that we're going to get into right now. So here is the video, and then I'll see you in the next lecture.
The story of writing, astronomy, and law. The story of civilization itself begins in one place. Not Egypt, not Greece, not Rome, but Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is an exceedingly fertile plain situated between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. For 5 millennia, this small strip of land situated in what is today Iraq, Kuwait, and Syria fostered innovations that would change the world forever. Inhabited for nearly 12,000 years, Mesopotamia's stable climate, rich soil, and steady supply of fresh water made it ideal for agriculture to develop and thrive. About 6,000 years ago, seemingly overnight, some of these agricultural settlements blossomed into some of the world's first cities. In the period between 4000 and 3100 BC, Mesopotamia was dotted with a constellation of competing city-states. At one point, they were unified under the Akkadian Empire and then broke apart, forming the empires of Assyria and Babylon. Despite near constant warfare, innovation and development thrived in ancient Mesopotamia. They built on a monumental scale, from palaces to ziggurats. Mammoth temples served as ritual locations to commune with the gods. They also developed advanced mathematics, including a base 60 system that created a 60-second minute, a 60-minute hour, and a 360-degree circular angle. The Babylonians used their sophisticated system of mathematics to map and study the sky. They divided one Earth year into 12 periods. Each was named after the most prominent constellations in the heavens, a tradition later adopted by the Greeks to create the zodiac. They also divided the week into 7 days, naming each after their 7 gods embodied by the 7 observable planets in the sky. But perhaps the most impactful innovation to come out of Mesopotamia is literacy. What began as simple pictures scrawled onto wet clay to keep track of goods and wealth developed into a sophisticated writing system by the year 3200 BC. This writing system would come to be called cuneiform in modern times and proved so flexible that, over the span of 3,000 years, it would be adapted for over a dozen different major languages and countless uses, including recording the law of the Babylonian king Hammurabi, which formed the basis of a standardized justice system. Eventually, Mesopotamia would fade, like its kings, into the mist of history, and its cities would sink beneath the sands of Iraq. But its ideas would prevail in literacy, law, math, astronomy, and the gift of civilization itself.